Right, well, good morning, everybody. As Will says, I've really only got 3 qualifications for being here. The first is that my son is a pupil here, a bit younger than most of you, but aspiring to be where you are. The second, as Will said, is that Will is his tutor, and the one thing I've worked out is always be nice to your son's tutor. And the third is that I have now been working for probably close to 30 years. And so when Will raised the subject with me, I thought what I would do is take full license from the brief given and talk to you about this subject. I was told to gently click. Let's see if it works. Actually, as an aside, I was just talking to Will earlier when we started this. We all take this technology for granted. I've spent about 15, 20 years working in the technology telecommunications field. And I still remember dial-up. Anyone in the audience ever used dial-up? That's pretty impressive. I was telling Will, it was only in 1999, which is not that long ago, 1999, that the first residential broadband connection was sold in this country. Fortunately, I learned presentation in the old days where you had acetate slides, which you put on slide projectors. But hopefully this will work today. So I'm going to talk to you about expectations, great expectations. I suspect all of you have studied great expectations along the way. And I thought that would be an interesting theme, because if I was sitting where you are sitting, and I could just about remember sitting where you were sitting, you're at that perfect stage in your life where you're full of expectation. And not only are you full of expectation, but lots of people have got expectations of you. And I suspect that most of you individually have got great expectations. And I suspect those people who've got expectations of you have got great expectations as well. As a result of sitting in this school and in this hall, you all have one thing in common. You're clever. You're bright. Anyone who's a St. Paul's student or graduate will, for the rest of their life, be greeted with the, should we let him cough it out? Be greeted with the, you're a St. Paul's boy. That's a great benefit. It's also a burden. I went to a local school in the centre of Scotland called Curry High School. I can tell you no one ever said to me, you're a Curry High School graduate. That was a burden and a benefit. So as you go on your path of life and you realize those expectations, how do you determine, A, what they should be, and how do you live up to them and get the most you can out of them? Now, I'm sure all of you can quote Charles Dickens in your sleep. Genuinely, he happens to be one of my favorite authors. And the general view, I think, was that Great Expectations was the best of his books. The best of his books. I think Chesterton said Great Expectations was written in the glory of the afternoon of his life. Fabulously written book. And it's a study of lots of things, but in my view, it's a study of 2 things. It's a study of a young man trying to work out where the truth really lies. And it's a study of a young man trying to work out what does he learn from and who does he learn from. Not learn for exams, not learn for qualifications, but learn for life. How do you exercise judgment? How do you judge people? How do you judge situations? How do you judge opportunities? How do you judge choices? And all of those realities will be the realities of the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years of your life. And I can tell you that the difference in your life journey will not be how clever you are. It'll be how you exercise those choices and those judgments. And that, more than anything, will determine whether your life path lives up to your expectations. This is one of my favorite little stories. I have no idea if it's true, but I rather hope it is. Anyone know who these two guys are? Yep.
That's Bach on the left and Beethoven.
It is indeed. It's Bach on the left and Beethoven on the right. And there's a great story that was written in some book about Beethoven, that when he died, Bach had a student who was absolutely in awe of Beethoven. And when he discovered that Beethoven died, he ran across the street in Vienna to see Bach, and he said, Herr Bach, it's an absolute tragedy. Beethoven has died. The world has ended for me, and I have written a Requiem Mass in his honor. And he handed the Requiem Mass to Herr Bach, and Bach looked at it, and he looked at the young man, and he said, young man, I think it might have been better if you had died and Beethoven had written the Mass. It's the moral of the story. The moral of the story is youth is a marvelous thing, but experience is a differentiating thing. And as you go through life, you will acquire experience. Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of State, or the ex-Secretary of State in the United States of America, had the great phrase, none of us know what we don't know, which is, of course, true. Because how can you know what you don't know? But nevertheless, you have to exercise judgment on the situation you find yourself in, regardless of what you know and what you don't know. So how do you go about seeing round corners and exercising judgments in a different way? And how do you go about living up to the expectations that are placed upon you? Anyone know these three gentlemen? Let's start over here. Anyone know who this is? Yep, gentleman there.
Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins.
Well done. How many people knew who this guy was? Be honest. 2. That's pretty good. How many people knew who this guy was? Nearly all of you. How many people who knew this guy was? Exactly right. Now, I've always thought this is a very interesting example of expectations. Here, picture this. There are 3 of you. You get chosen to be the 3 astronauts to go to the moon. And you are going to be the 3 people who land on the moon. This guy gets to be the first man on the moon. This guy gets to be the second man on the moon. This guy gets to stay in the car and drive it home. Now, can you imagine that reality? You've gone all the way, 2 of your mates have landed on the moon, and you've had to stay in the spacecraft and take them home safely. Can you imagine the expectations that you have of yourself when you set out on that journey, and then how you deal with it afterwards? This man, very sadly, died recently. And I don't know if any of you read any of the biographies or obituaries that were written about Neil Armstrong. The thing I was most struck by was that this was a man who, from the minute he stepped down off that ladder, literally became global property, probably the first global celebrity. He became public property. And the thing about becoming public property is, what's the truth of property? You own it. What's the truth of public property? Everybody thinks they own it. So the minute you become public property, the expectations placed upon you don't just become the expectations of you or your family or those who care for you, but the rest of the world brings an expectation. How many times have you opened a story and read about someone who is famous, a so-called celebrity, and you have reached your own judgment about that person and what they have allegedly done or not done based upon the fact that you believe you have a right to have an opinion because they're public property? I saw a poll the other day that said amongst people under the age of 15, the thing that they were most keen to be was famous. Funny thing being famous. Because the minute you become famous, the expectations that you have to live up to aren't just your own. They're everybody's. I don't know if this is true, but I read it the other day in a analyst report, that there are more people alive today than there are people who've ever lived. It's quite remarkable. The other remarkable thing about that is if it's true, or even if it's approximately true, what does that mean? It means it's much more difficult to make your mark because the world's a bigger place. There are many, many talented, bright, able, driven, ambitious, focused, original, innovative people. And they all want to make their mark. They all want to make a difference, make a contribution, make an impact, do something different for themselves, for their family, for the community they live in, for the thing they care about, for the thing they're passionate about. And the world is a truly global place. I work for a French company, so it's now compulsory for me to quote famous French people in every public speech I give. Back in 1803, Napoleon, who was a pretty clever guy, had a pretty big impact on the rest of the world, looked to the east and said, we should be careful, because when China wakes up, the rest of the world's going to worry. Now, we now know that China's more than woken up. We now know, because it's pretty documented, that we now live in a world where there are two power blocks, the United States of America and China. And Europe, which is struggling to work out quite what its raison d'etre is in the world, because by and large Europe, in institutional terms, was created to be a peace bloc, not to be a power bloc. And the world is now run on a bipolar power position between the East and the West. And if you spend any time in China, which I'm sure many of you will have done, every time I go to China, I come home and my children say to me, what was it like? And I say, you should be really worried. Because I am consistently impressed by the energy, the application, the ambition, the self-sacrifice, the long-term view, the level of expectation that they have individually and collectively about the impact they are going to have on their own lives and on the lives of the rest of the world. So as you step out next year, once you've bagged your A-levels and decided where you're going to go or what you're going to do or what you're going to study, or whether you're going to take some time out and then whether you're going to go somewhere else, how do you make those steps in a way whereby for each step you take, you get a little bit more out of it than you might otherwise do? So here's 3 pieces of advice. The first, which is always an odd piece of advice to give when you're giving a presentation, is learn to listen. Right? Learn to listen. How many of you are sportsmen? A lot of you. How many of you think you're pretty good sportsmen? Come on, don't be modest. This is St. Paul's. Right. If you're a pretty good sportsman, what have you done? You've put in a lot of hours. You've taken your sport and you've learned how to play a stroke, kick a ball, hold a ball, whatever the particular skill is. Should I tell you a great life skill? Listening. And a bit like in sport, learn how to listen. I worked for someone who said to me very early on in life, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. At a minimum, use them in that proportion. At a maximum, learn how to listen. And here's a test. Put yourself in a situation where you know nothing, in a subject about which you know nothing. Walk into that situation or that circumstance, and all you have to rely upon is your listening skills. And then at the end of that situation, you should have learnt enough to know what the answer is. When you go into life, that's the truth. Because you can go into a situation or a circumstance and know very, very little. It's amazing what you can pick up if you listen. So learn to listen. The second is learn to learn. Now, I suspect many of you believe you've spent years learning how to learn. Maybe. Learn how to learn isn't something you leave behind when you leave either school or university. Maybe some of you will go on and do postgraduate work. Maybe some of you, like I did, will go on to business school. Maybe some of you will take a second career. But with the life expectancy that we now all have, you have to keep learning for all of your life if you want to stay current. I'm not like you. I didn't grow up with technology coming out of the tap, but it's the reality of my working life. I had to relearn that at 30. I changed career at 35. I had to learn a completely new industry. You will always have to keep learning. So learning is a constant. The third is learn how to like. And that, I think, is a really important one, because boredom thresholds are very, very low these days, I observe. Now I sound like old Father Time here. This is the boring old fart commercial. Boredom thresholds are very low. When you start in life, what you'll find is quite a lot of what you'll do is boring. It doesn't really matter what you do. You could be a lawyer, you could be a doctor, you could be a film star, you could be a film director, you could be a technologist, you could be a software engineer, be a politician. There's grunt work in everything. You have to learn to like. You have to learn to like the stuff you don't like as well as the stuff you do like. Because people like to be around people who like what they're doing. And then the final one is a typo. That should say is to lean. And leaning, not learning, is a really important thing. What do I mean by leaning? What I mean is lean into other people. Here today, you probably lean into your friendship groups. You probably lean into your tutors, your masters, maybe your parents a bit, maybe not, I don't know. I sometimes wonder with my own children. But as you go through life, identify people you can lean on. Officially, they sometimes call themselves mentors. But the more mentors you can pick up through life, the more people you can find to lean on, the easier it'll be. Penultimate piece of advice, particularly for this group. One of the things you always think is the best thing to be is to be the cleverest guy in the room. My strong advice is if you're the cleverest guy in the room, either find other people or find another room, because you're not stretching yourself. So don't set yourself the target of being the smartest guy in the room, because all it means is you're not really pushing yourself. So you've set your expectation level way too low. And that's an easy thing to say and a hard thing to do, because it means you've got to have higher expectations and demands on yourself than other people will have of you. And here is my final comment. Don't judge books by covers. This is so easy to say, but is so true. Look for the facts, look for the evidence, and avoid the labels. You will go through life and you will come across people who you will judge based upon what they wear, how they talk, where they've come from, what school they were at, what university they went to, what degree they did, what first job they had, what their parents were, what nationality they are. These are all labels. They tell you something, but trust me, they tell you really very little. They tell you very little about how to make judgments. What they tell you are the superficial facts. They don't really give you the evidence you need to be able to exercise real judgment, which will allow you to make the choice or the decision that will differentiate you from the other person. So those are my tips on expectations.